Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today not to give you a review of either of these lenses, but rather a quick comparison of what I perceive as strengths and weaknesses if you're trying to decide between the two. And so those two lenses are the Sony FE 200 to 600 millimeter f5.6 to 6.3 GOSS lens, and then the new Tamron 150 to 500 millimeter f5 to 6.7 Di3 VC VXD lens. Both of these are for Sony FE, and they come in at different price points and obviously a little bit different design philosophy, which lends to both strengths and weaknesses for both of them. Now, if you want a more extensive review of either one of these lenses, you can check out either my extensive coverage of the Sony by clicking at the link here, and if you are interested in checking out my full coverage of the Tamron, you can do so by clicking on the link up above here. There's also links to both reviews down in the description below if you want to check out that. And so both of these lenses, while they don't have identical focal ranges, they are designed essentially for the same kind of purpose, and I think in many ways are marketed to the same kind of potential buyer. So one of the first things to point out as far as distinguishing the two is when it comes to price. The Sony reaches out 100 millimeters further, but it obviously is a much larger lens and it has a larger price, about $2,000 US. The Tamron goes 50 millimeters wider and doesn't reach quite as far, ending off at 500 millimeters, but it is fairly extensively cheaper at around $1,400 US. And so first of all, let's talk about reasons why you might want to consider the Tamron lens. And this is, to this point, I think the best third-party telephoto lens that has come to the Sony platform, and it does have a number of strengths. Very obviously, as you can see the lenses in front of me here, the Tamron is significantly smaller for transport. It's about 41% shorter in overall length compared to the Sony, and thus it's going to fit in far more carry solutions. It's far more likely that you're going to be able to transport it with the camera mounted, maybe even the lens hood in place, ready for use. And so if you value transport, maybe you have a restriction of how much size luggage you can carry going on safari, or if you're backpacking and you only have so much room in your carry solution, whatever it is, the Tamron gives you a lot more versatility on how it can be stored and how it can be transported. Those physical advantages carry on when it comes to the front of the lens here, where you have a fairly common 82 millimeter front filter thread. And so if you're wanting to, for example, use a circular polarizing filter, which can be really useful for enriching colors, maybe helping to reduce reflections, depending on where you're shooting and under what conditions, that can be very advantageous. And so an 82 millimeter versus a 95 millimeter front filter thread. The Tamron switches feel better. As far as the overall build, both of these are really, really nicely made lenses. The Sony has ever so slightly more metals in the construction. The Tamron has a mixture of metals and engineered plastics, but both of them have extensive weather sealing, and so that's not necessarily the problem. But when it comes to the physical design, I do prefer the switches on the Tamron that have just a little bit more of a high-end feel. They're a little easier to access. The ones on the Sony are quite small and a little less definite in their action, and so I actually prefer the switches on the Tamron. The Tamron is lighter. Now, looking at them, sitting side by side, you'd expect that weight distance difference to be significant. It's actually not. It's 215 grams difference between the two lenses, and that puts the Tamron at right under 2 kilograms and the Sony right over the top of 2 kilograms. So 215 grams difference, but if you're really counting the grams, that could be significant. I'll also note on the weight front that you do have the ability to fully remove the entire tripod collar from the Tamron, whereas on the Sony you can't actually remove a collar. What you can do is remove the foot, but there's not as much potential weight savings there. And just as an aside, I do appreciate the fact that the Tamron is actually nicely finished off under this area. Sometimes lenses, if you remove their tripod collar, they really look unfinished, maybe with exposed screw heads or whatever. This has a nice clean look, and so it's probably unlikely that you would often want to totally remove the tripod collar, but if you do so, it doesn't look unwieldy or unfinished. one significant area of advantage for the Tamron over the Sony is that the Sony has a fairly typical, for a big telephoto, minimum focus distance of 2.4 meters, 240 centimeters. And that gives you a rather low 0.20 times magnification. Not that that's unusable, that's useful, just not nearly as like what you're going to get on the Tamron. The Tamron gives you a variable minimal focus distance, and so you can get much closer at, for example, at 150 millimeters than you can at 500 millimeters. You can get as close as 60 centimeters or 0.6 meters on 150 millimeters and 1.8 meters at 500 millimeters. Either way, you can get significantly closer than you can with the Sony, and at either point, you have a much higher magnification figure. The highest figure comes at that 150 millimeter length, and that gives you as high as right over 0.33 times of magnification. Very useful, almost 1/3 life size. And then at 500 millimeters, you have a still very useful 0.27 times. Both of those figures significantly higher than the 0.20 times for the Sony. One final advantage for the Tamron that I want to point out is when it comes to the tripod foot. The tripod foot is Arca-Swiss compatible, which means you can go right on a tripod with it. The Sony doesn't have that, and I have no idea why. So let's talk about why you might want to consider the Sony instead. The Sony, for some people, will particularly value the fact that this is an internally zooming design. And what I mean by that is that the overall length of the lens is fixed, which is, by the way, why it is so much larger physically. If you zoom the Tamron out 8 centimeters, as you know, when it's fully zoomed out, the difference in the two lenses is far less significant, though still appreciable. But the Sony is completely internally zooming, which gives you a few advantages. Number one, I know that some of you will value the weather sealing on an internally zooming lens, trust it more than what you do on a lens that is kind of going in and out, and there's the concern that that pump action will suck some dust into the lens barrel eventually over use. The Tamron is weather sealed against that, but I know that a lot of you trust internally zooming lenses more. And so that's an advantage. Also in the field, I find that just changing focal lengths, it's literally something you can do with just a fingertip and do very quickly. In the field, once I'm already there, I certainly prefer the handling of the Sony for that reason. It's really, really great for utilizing in the field because it's big to get it there, but once you get it there, it's really great to use. Another thing that the Sony has that the Tamron doesn't is that we actually have, in 3 different positions, we have Sony's focus hold button, which just gives you another point of control on the lens and a little bit more versatility in controlling it. Now, a big difference between the two that is kind of Sony imposed, but it is a factor to consider, and that is that the Sony is designed for use with teleconverters. You can use either a 1.4 times or Sony branded 2 times teleconverter, and obviously have those variations to the actual focal range. And so, getting you out to about 840 millimeters, even with the 1.4 times, as much as 1200 millimeters using a 2 times teleconverter. The Tamron is not physically designed to receive a teleconverter, and from what I understand, that is an imposed limitation by Sony. And so unfortunately, we haven't seen any third-party lenses that are designed for use with teleconverters on the Sony platform. So that's a pretty big, significant advantage. Obviously, the Sony does have a slightly bigger zoom range in general, and so going from 2 times all the way up to, or 200 millimeters all the way up to 600 millimeters, it just covers a 400 millimeter span, which is a bit more than the 350 millimeters that you see covered by the zoom range on the Tamron. And of course, being able to get that extra 100 millimeters on the telephoto in, where it's arguably most useful and far less likely to be replicated by other lenses, is a significant factor for sure. And finally, if you use one of Sony's action cameras, be it the A9 series or the Alpha 1, there is a big reason why you might want to consider the Sony rather than the Tamron. It's another artificial Sony limitation, but at this point, Sony is capping off third-party burst rate on its sports bodies at 15 frames per second. Now, obviously, 15 frames per second is still a lot, and you can capture a lot of action with the Tamron at that. However, if you've invested in that shiny Alpha 1 and it's 30 frames per second, you're only going to get half of that with the Tamron, whereas if you use the Sony, you can unleash the full potential of frames per second on the lens. And that obviously can be a really big factor if you're invested in one of the actual action cameras from Sony. There is less variability in the aperture on the Sony, but I don't consider that to be a tremendous strength. There's only 1/3 difference over the focal range, so you don't have much lighting changes, and I do like that. But the reality is that over a lot of the shared zoom range, the Tamron actually has a bit of an aperture advantage and lets in a little bit more light. And it's only when you get to about 480 millimeters that it goes past the Sony's f6.3 to f6.7. So we're going to call that a wash at the end of the day. So hopefully this helps you in if you're trying to weigh between these two lenses and looking beyond the obvious factor of the differences in price. There's quite a different philosophy in the design here and different strengths and weaknesses, and maybe this list can help you to parse out what matters most to you, and that may be able to help to influence to give you a wise buying decision. I'm Dustin Abbott, and again, if you look in the description down below, you can find links to my reviews of both of these lenses, and of course there's buying links there if you'd like to check that out for yourself. And beyond that, there's linkage to pick up some DA merch, to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Let the light in.